Okay, this is not Macarena. This is strictly speaking of Bookstream, and I'm getting back on my. We've raised the big curtain. You can see behind me my daughter's work area. The computer is up and running, ready to go. On the left there, I've got that's where I work when I stream from over there, and then her computer is right there, and you can see that's the fish tank that I'm always talking about with um, the yellow submarine. I'm so really miss me. She loves the yellow submarine. She's scared. And this is the thing. I think that she's got a kind of a disconnect. Oh, about her, she made a big boo-hoo, yeah, crying in the morning, and she was like, "I want you to give me a surprise." I was like, "What is she even saying?" Because she's really screaming. She's like, "I want a surprise! I want a surprise!" And I cast about, and you know what I found? We have an online bookstore here, and I just reached on a bookshelf and I was like, let me see if I can find a book that she would think would be cool. And it was like a do-it-yourself build a playground, uh, like uh, like you see at public parks and everything. Build it yourself, the tools you'll need, and all that stuff like that. And yeah, I gave her that, and it's like, look, it's a book. It tells you how to build a playground. You want to build a playground at our house? And I'd really like to build a big gazebo kind of thing, but like a big rectangular, like go out there as if I'm going to build a smaller playground, and then put the beams up for a big, first a cover, and then put a floor, right? I've taken an interest in this whole thing of decomposing wood, right? And, one of the things that has not been really thought about in terms of climate change, there's been a lot of focus on pollution and cars, exhaust, fossil fuels, and everything like that. But carbon is actually bound up in things that decompose, for example, wood, right? And some estimates of how much wood decomposes, it's almost equal to all um, the automotive car emissions. I saw an estimate, and I don't want to say something stupid and wrong. It could be completely wrong. Somebody said something like, we did this estimate. God knows how they did it. But it made if this much wood rots every year, it's really comparable to all these fossil fuels that we're putting out. This is gigatons of carbon are released into the atmosphere. So we should do something about it. And one of the things, I talk about antiquities and how, things are more valuable if people value things more if they're extremely old or something like that, even if they're. And I talked in an earlier talk about, for example, I take the book of Tobit, for example, and I'm reading, on the book, on the Macarena show, I'm going through Gratz history of the Jews, and it's at the stage in history where they say that this idea of Gehenna as a place, hell, and everything came from Persia, from Iran, and became syncretized into Judaism. And I want to get a date on that, because I've all in the course of my study, when you look at things attributed to Solomon, and in Judaism in its original form, it seems like they're taking a strong stand against this idea that there is an afterlife, They're like, no, people, according to our creation story, we were called forth and formed out of the dust of the ground. And look, if you take somebody and they die, right, you put them there and watch them, they turn into dust again, right? So in Solomon, that's where you get the Ecclesiastes. It's attributed to Solomon. But it doesn't have the stuff about there's going to be, a paradise or whatever. You're going to be eating Leviathan in a big table with all the righteous or whatever forever. No. It says you're dust, ashes to ashes, and dust to dust. To the dust you shall return. And everything that you do is futile. Vanity, and a chase after wind. That's more like the original idea of Judaism. And you can see it in stark contrast to the Egyptian thought, where they made this huge industry of death. Like, you have to get prepared. You could spend your whole life gathering up riches and money to prepare yourself to pay all these people to handle your travel to the afterlife. You've got to have all these surgeries, and you got to have all your organs prepared in a certain way, and you have to be mummified in a certain way, and then all your grave goods have to be gathered together. Right, and this could be a big disaster. Some people would argue that you got this with the Qin Emperor, one of the biggest tombs in China, which still has not been completely excavated. The first guy that unified what we call today modern China, or this large territory. It was a different territory then, but that was the first thing that was called Qin, because it was this guy Qin, China. Not China, right? But the Qin dynasty, that's where the country formed. This guy, it was like when he was getting ready to die, it was spare no expense. Let's take it. We're taking it all with us to the next world. And you can see how that can become a big social problem, and I think it was true of the Egyptians, and it's kind of sort of an abuse of the prosperity brought about by the richness of the Nile Delta. You've got, if you could imagine, out of these out of Africa, here comes the Nile towards the Nile Delta or whatever, and it's depositing all this rich sediment, and it floods every year. It's a great place to grow food, and naturally, it would make for a lot of easy living, very, very. And then people come up, well, how do I earn money? Well, I could make up some ancestor or some deity or whatever and officiate for that deity and do magic tricks and get money that way, improve my station that way. And that's sort of, you kind of get the feeling about Egypt that was a big thing. And you can note, like, in terms of the historicity of the Exodus, we don't really have multiply attested history. We've got a version that was passed down to Jews. This is how it happened, right? But there's also a Samaritan version, which is different, right? And then there's some historical evidence. Now, where is that? Okay, it's a place called Tel El Amarna. Amarna, just remember that, A-M-A-R-N-A, Amarna, right? And what is Amarna? Well, there was a guy that tried to promulgate, it's the father of the pharaoh, the king, the Messiah, Tutankhamun, right? His father, Akhenaten, is said to have tried to institute monotheism, right? And stop all this. Oh, there's this deity for this and this deity for that, and I've got a priest for this and a priest for that, officiate this, curse for that, blessing for this, And it just becomes this huge industry, and there's no end of it. And it's a lot of banana oil, right? People are just trying to scam and get over, right? So you could well imagine that that's a real thing. And Amarna was a city that was set up at the time When Akhenaten was trying to say we're gonna promulgate a new religion, a monotheistic religion, it's not well received naturally by the people that were, fine with everything like it was. So why is Amarna important? Some tablets were found, I think a palace burned or something like that, and they were writing on clay tablets, and because there was a fire, it kind of baked these tablets. And it turns out that amongst those tablets there was some kind of edict ordering the expulsion of a group called the Habiru, which may very well have been the Hebrews. And this is like, around the turn of the century, there was a question of like, is anything in the Bible true? Because once you get back into books like Genesis, and we don't, there's no hard evidence of the people that are talked about. It's wonderful that they preserve something. But as it's handed down from generation to generation, how much of it gets kind of changed or altered? And I'll put this out for example, the Vikings, the Icelandic cultures. They preserved their history through these songs, like the Greeks did this thing with Homeric hymns or whatever, where you sing the whole history. A bard and learns how to sing it, and it's sort of like movie night. You hire a bard, you get in your ale hall, you're closed in for the winter or whatever like that, and you have these guys that tell the long story of your history. Well, it really starts getting recorded for the Vikings in about the 5th century in the oral form. It's not until 5 centuries later, about 1,000 of the Common Era, and check, don't take my word for it, I could be off a little bit, but I think I'm pretty accurate. A Snorri Sturluson, right, started to write down these songs, these oral traditions, and wonderfully, a lot of them are preserved. But they're songs that were sung through generations for half a millennia before they were written down. Think about that, right? How much could they change during that time, and how accurate are they? So for a Jewish person, and well, I'm mixed. I'm the ultimate mutt. I've got Roma. I've got everything the Nazis would gas me for. I've got Central European Jew DNA, and I've got Hispanic Jew DNA. I've got Roma. I've got Italian. But my dominating DNA is Central European Irish, right? So if you look at all these different cultures, you can see how individuals could get this feeling of, I really value and treasure the traditions that are passed down, and I want to examine them over and over again and look for historical evidence that validates or invalidates or something like that. And the couple of things, okay, the tablets at Amarna established that there was an expulsion of the Habiru, and there's a scholarly argument, are these even the Jews of the Bible? Because some people are like, none of that stuff happened. It's all mythology of the Jews that they made up. That's a way of taking it. And then, you could you have this position of like, are these Habiru the Hebrews, right? And it's interesting that about the time that we place historically that we expect the Exodus to have happened, these tablets appeared at a place established by a monotheistic pharaoh, Akhenaten, and these tablets recorded an expulsion because of a plague that this group of Habiru or whatever were expelled from Egypt because they had some kind of a plague. And it's a very old attestation, which is contemporaneous sensationalism of things. to our surviving Exodus narrative. But it's on a much larger scale. And another thing is Egyptians notoriously, in their history, this is a thing about a distinction with the Jewish people, is that they preserve the voices of dissidents, i.e. the prophets are dissident voices. You're doing wrong and it's going to lead to disaster. And a lot of times during the lifetime of a prophet, they're vilified, this person comes up and he starts making these attestations, and everybody's like, kill that guy, everything's fine, he should shut up, right? And then, they go out like Ahab going after Elijah. Nobody, Elisha is I think we give that as the witness of his apotheosis, his his ascension into heaven in a fiery chariot is attested by a guy that saw it, Elisha, who happens to be a follower after him. But we also know that people that were associated with Ahab and Jezebel really were trying to kill him, that they had sent killers out to get him to shut up. Ahab said, there is not a foreign god. Elijah famously said there was Joshua's curse was going to be fulfilled if somebody rebuilt Jericho, because the ruins of Jericho were supposed to be an eternal attestation to the miracle of the collapse of the walls in the siege of Jericho. It was never supposed to be rebuilt, and if it was rebuilt, when the work started, the person that initiated the work would his sons would begin to die. And when the rebuilding of Jericho was complete, his last offspring would die off. And supposedly this really happened. And Elijah actually visited the guy, and the guy spoke. He said honorable things to Elijah, because he respected when everything that the prophet said happened. After the fact, he was like, you were right all along. But there was, what was happening is in the sense of like the Levite core had said, Moses just made all that crap up. Look at me, I've got money, follow me. Right? And the earth swallows him up. The ancient story is like a chasm opens and him and his followers all drop down this pit. Did they make a booby hatch? That's what I want to know. Did they go set up this meeting place and they had their tent there, and there were these guys underneath that pull some rope and falls down in, and they dump dirt on top of them and bury them all? Or did God really cause a chasm to open up? We'll never know. But on that line, we have commentary that says Elijah goes to Ahab and he says, if you rebuild Jericho, the curse is going to fall on the person that does it. Heel is the guy's name. Heel. All his offspring are going to die off, and there's going to be a famine, right? And the commentary says that Ahab is like, you dumbass, he's like, look, there's no idol, false god or whatever to whom I have not given homage, and I enjoy, everything's going great, man. I don't believe, he's like that. He's like, all this stuff's not going to come true. And what he says is, you're telling me, okay, the curse of Joshua is nothing Moses has said that was going to happen to us has come true. And you're saying the curse of Joshua is going to come true. So you say Joshua's going to come true when what Moses said didn't come true. And supposedly Elijah said, yep, it's going to be just like that. Right. And sure enough, it happened. And then when all these disasters started happening, Ahab and his wife Jezebel, as queen or whatever, said, somebody go kill that guy, because once he says it, then it starts happening, because that's a belief they had about the prophets. It's like when the prophet actually, if you can stop him from talking, right, then you have a chance. Like God's anger is already there. You're already doing something wrong. But if you can shut the mouth of the prophet, you have a chance to fix things. But once the prophet actually opens his mouth and speaks to the multitude and said, this disaster is coming, even God can't stop it. That's the old belief, so. I made a connection there between Ahab and Korah. I don't know how you say that guy's name. You remember the guy, the Levite? He was really rich, and they were. He was like, "Don't follow Moses. Follow me. I'm rich." Right? Moses just made up all that stuff, right? So they have a big meeting, and when the guy comes to the meeting and sets up his tent or whatever, all his followers are there or whatever, the earth opens up and they're all swallowed up in this big chasm, and they die, whatever. Did that really happen? I don't know. Wouldn't it be cool if one day they were doing an archaeological dig and they found the skeletons of those Levites? The money men, as it were. But I am going to get this book going for a while.
Displeasure towards the former. Several 415 borderlands lying between Samaria and Jud, which had often occasioned strife between the two peoples, he awarded to the Judanes, and likewise freed the latter from the burden of taxation during the sabbatical year. This favor, of small importance to him who gave it, was a great boon to those who received it, and inflamed the hatred of the Samaritans against the Judanes. Every gust of wind seemed to add new fuel to their enmity, which, however, as long as Alexander lived, they were obliged to conceal. His wonderfully rapid and victorious campaigns as far as the Indus and the Caucasus seemed to throw a spell over the world, and to paralyze all independent action. When he was not at war, peace reigned supreme, from Greece to India, and from Ethiopia to the shores of the Caspian Sea. Alexander was the first conqueror who deemed it a wise policy to allow the peculiar customs of any conquered nation to be maintained. He insisted that respect should be shown to their various religious forms of worship. In Egypt he honored Apis and Ammon, and in Babylonia the gods of Kald. Thus he determined upon rebuilding the temple of the Babylonian idol Bel, which had been destroyed by Artaxerxes. To accomplish this, he ordered his soldiers to clear away the ruins which had accumulated over the foundations of the building. All obeyed with the exception of the Judanes who, either voluntarily or by compulsion, were serving in his army. They refused their help towards the reconstruction of the idolatrous temple. Naturally enough, their disobedience received severe chastisement from their superior officers, but they bore their punishment bravely, rather than comply with an order which demanded the transgression of one of the principal injunctions of their faith. When Alexander heard of this case of conscience and of the religious fortitude displayed by the Judan soldiers, he was generous enough to grant them his pardon. But in that incident we may read an omen of the conflicts 416 which were to take place between Judaism and Greekdom. In the midst of his vast undertaking of uniting the whole world into one monarchy, the young hero died 323, leaving no lawful heir to his throne, no successor to his great mind. Confusion arose in all parts of the world, as well as among the armies of Alexander, as if the laws of nature had been upset, and the sequence of the morrow after today were no longer certain. Fearful battles, which resembled the wars of the Titans, ensued. Alexander's warriors, with the experience gained on 1,000 battlefields, would, had they only been united, have been capable of supporting the structure of the Macedonian kingdom. But, although they were not actually Greeks, and even looked down upon the latter, they resembled them in their spirit of insubordination, their want of discipline, and their passion for self-advancement, which greatly surpassed their zeal for the good of the state. Like the Greeks, they coveted power as a means to obtain luxuries and to enable them to indulge in licentious pleasures. In short, they had become adepts in corrupt practices. The consequence of the state of things was the dissolution of the Macedonian kingdom and its division among the contending leaders. Ptolemy I Soter, son of Lagos, reigned in Egypt. By means of a successful war he acquired Caesarea, together with Jud. In 320, he demanded the surrender of Jerusalem, but its inhabitants refused to open their gates. On the Sabbath, however, he contrived to surprise the city, and, as the Judanes would not use weapons of defense on that day, he was able to seize the city and to make numerous prisoners, whom he carried away to Egypt. Many Samaritans shared their fate, probably because they had likewise attempted resistance. Both Judanes and Samaritans could have enjoyed happiness t least, as much happiness as was possible in those hard, cruel times had they remained subjects for 17 of the Lygidian Ptolemy, who was the gentlest of the warring successors of Alexander. He knew how to recognize and appreciate merit, and when his own interests were not at stake, he was just and merciful. But Ptolemy had no acknowledged right upon Caesarea. His acquisition of those lands had not been confirmed by the various regions of the Macedonian kingdom who followed each other in rapid succession, and kept up the semblance of a united government. Ptolemy roused the envy of the Confederate captains, and in particular that of one of his former allies and fellow conspirators, Antigonus. This bold soldier was endowed with inventive genius and a fiery nature, and had resolved upon the subjection of all his associates, in order to seize and hold the whole kingdom of Macedonia in his own strong hand. After many years of warlike preparations, a decisive battle at last took place between Demetrius, the son of Antigonus, and Ptolemy, which ended disastrously for the former. The Battle of Gaza, fought in the spring of 312, was a memorable one, for from that event Seleucus, who had come as a fugitive to Ptolemy, stated the beginning of his power by introducing the new era called Seleucidan, or Greek, which also came into use among the Judanes, and was longest retained by them. In consequence of the defeat at Gaza, Demetrius was obliged to withdraw to the north, leaving the whole country to the conqueror. Only a short time elapsed, however, before Antigonus and his son, having joined their forces, compelled Ptolemy to retreat to Egypt. He caused the fortified seacoast and inland cities, Akko, Joppa, Gaza, and Jerusalem to be demolished, so that they might not become places of defense to his enemies, and Jud, with the countries that belonged to sea Assyria, remained in this unguarded condition until, in the battle at Ipsus, in Asia Minor 301, fought against the united armies of Ptolemy, Lysimachus, Cassander, and Seleucus. 418 Antigonus lost at one blow both his glory and his life. The four generals divided the kingdom among themselves. Ptolemy received Egypt and the adjoining lands, and the greater part of Asia fell to Seleucus. Thus Jud became a portion of the Ptolemon or Lygidian kingdom, and its fate for a time was linked to that of the latter. The condition of the Judanes, however, underwent no material change. The tribute they had been obliged formerly to pay to the Persian monarch was now demanded by the Egypto-Macedonian court. The freedom and independence of their movements and actions were not more restricted than they had hitherto been. On the contrary, their situation might be considered rather improved than otherwise. In Jud, the high priest, who was answerable for the payment of taxes, was considered as the political chief, and was looked upon as a sacerdotal prince. Ptolemy I was endowed with a gentle nature, and inclined to benefit his subjects. He had neither desire nor motive to oppress the Judanes. Alexandria, the seaport city founded by Alexander, and considered as the capital of his kingdom by the first Egypto-Macedonian monarch, acquired a large population, and it could only be a source of satisfaction to him to see Judanes from the neighboring country establishing themselves there. Under Alexander, many Judanes had settled in that city, and, as this far-seeing hero had given equal rights of Macedonian citizenship to all comers, the first Judan colony in Alexandria enjoyed perfect equality with the other inhabitants, and led a peaceful existence in the new land. A great number of Judanes took up their abode there during the disturbed state of their country, caused by the wars of Antigonus. They also received from Ptolemy protection and the enjoyment of equal laws and rights. And thus arose an Egypto-Judan community, which was destined to fulfill a peculiar mission. In other places also Judan 419 colonies were formed. Assured of the goodwill of the Judanes, Ptolemy distributed them in various Egyptian cities and in Cyrene. Seleucus, the founder of the Seleucidan kingdom, the center of which was situated in Persia, had in addition become possessed of the northern part of Syria, where he founded a new city, Antioch, which became his capital. In order to people this city, as well as other newly built towns, he was obliged to bring inhabitants into them, and among these partly forced and partly willing settlers were many Judanes, to whom Seleucus gave the full rights of Macedonian citizenship. And, as Judan colonies arose in the Gro-Macedonian countries, so also Greek colonies were formed upon Judan ground. Along the Mediterranean coast new seaports were built, or old ones enlarged and embellished, and to these Grecian names were given. 420. Chapter XXI. Simon the Just and his descendants. Condition of the Judanes under the Ptolemies. Simon effects improvements. His praises are sung by Sirach. His doctrines. The Trisidim and the Nazarites. Simon's children. Onis second in the revolt against Egypt. Joseph, son of Tobias. His embassy to Alexandria. He is appointed tax collector. War between Antiochus the Great and Egypt. Defeat of Antiochus. Spread of Greek manners in Jud. Hyrcanus. The Song of Songs. Simon II. Scopas despoils Jerusalem. The contest between Antiochus and Rome. Continued Hellenization of the Judanes. The Trisidim and the Hellenists. Jose ben Joser and Jose ben Johanan. Onias III and Simon. Heliodorus. Sirach spoke of Proverbs against the errors of his time. 300-175 BCE. For more than a century after the death of Nehemiah, the inner life of the Judan nation might have been likened to that of a caterpillar weaving the threads which enshrouded from the juices of its own body, while the world knew it as a martyr, bearing insult and humiliation alike in silence. During that period it had not produced any one man, who, by reason of his own strong individuality, had been able to bring into play the reserve force of the nation. No one had arisen capable of pointing the way and arousing enthusiasm. The stimulus for development and improvement had always come from without, from the principal men of Persia or Babylonia. But now the people, in consequence of new political circumstances, were separated from their co-religionists of those lands. The Judanes of the Euphrates and the Tigris could no longer carry on active intercourse with their brethren in the mother country. For the reigning dynasties, the Seleucid and the Ptolemies, looked upon each other with suspicion. 421 and frequent visits of the Judanes from the provinces of the Seleucid to the Judanes of Jerusalem would have been regarded with disfavor in Alexandria. Had the nation not been able to rally in its own country without extraneous help, it would have been lost. A people which cannot exist or improve of itself must sooner or later fall into insignificance. But the right man arose at the right time. He saved the Judan community from its fall. This man was Simon the Just, about 300-270. In an age deficient in great men, he appears like a lofty and luxuriant tree in the midst of a barren country. Legendary lore has seized upon his name, and has added the marvelous to the historical. It is always a favorable testimony to an historical personage, and to the influence he wields over a large circle, when romance proclaims his praise. Authentic history does not tell us much of Simon I, still the few characteristics preserved to us portray him as a man of great distinction. He was, moreover, the one high priest of the house of Joshua ben Jozzek, of whom there is anything laudatory to be related, and the one to restore the priesthood to honor. He cared for his people to save it from falling. He rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem, which had been demolished by Ptolemy I, and he repaired the ravages of 2 centuries upon the temple. He also carried out various measures for the safety and improvement of the capital. The supply of water from the several springs in the neighborhood of Jerusalem is insufficient for ordinary purposes in dry seasons. The temple, too, required water in copious quantities. To meet these requirements, Simon caused a large reservoir to be excavated below the temple, which was fed by a subterranean canal, and brought a constant supply of fresh water from the springs of Edom. Thus there was no fear of drought, even in case of a siege. The poet, Joshua Jesus Sirach, who lived at a later date, gives us an enthusiastic description of Simon. 422. How was he distinguished in the midst of the people in his coming out of the sanctuary? He was as the morning star in the midst of a cloud, and as the full moon in the vernal season. As the sun shining upon the temple of the Most High, and as the rainbow giving light in the bright clouds. When he put on the robe of honor, and was clothed with the garments of glory. Compassed with his brethren round about, like palms around a cedar of Lebanon. Eclipse. 1. 5-12. Not only was Simon the Just recognized in his office of high priest as head of the community and of the supreme council, but he was also the chief teacher in the house of learning. He inculcated this maxim upon his disciples: the world that is, the Judean community rests on three things: on the law, on divine service in the temple, and on charity above I. 2. One may also ascribe to this remarkable man some share in the following saying of one of his most distinguished pupils, Antigonus of Soho: be not like those slaves, who serve their master for their daily rations, but be rather like the servants who faithfully serve their master without expectation of reward. Although Simon the Just attached great importance to the sacrificial rites, still he disliked the excessive ceremonialism towards which his generation was tending, nor did he conceal his disapprobation. There were amongst the nation some overpious people who took the vow of the Nazarite to refrain from wine for a given time. They called themselves, or were called, the strictly pious Chassidim. When the term of their vows had expired, they cut off their hair and went through all the ceremonies. Perhaps the excesses of the Greeks and their Jewish followers, their numerous feasts and orgies induced them to impose upon themselves this Nazaritic abstention with its attendant rites. It is certain that as the number of pleasure-seeking imitators of Greek habits increased in Jud, so did also that of the Chassidim. But Simon the Just was not pleased with this exaggerated zeal, and took no part in the sacrifices of the Nazarites. For 23 posterity has formed so exalted an opinion of Simon's character, that it designated his death as the end of an historical period of divine grace. In fact, sad and terrible events, brought about by his own descendants, and causing fresh trials to the Judeans, followed upon his death. Simon the Just left 2 children, a young son named Onias and a daughter. The latter was married to Tobiah, a somewhat distinguished man of priestly descent. Onias, being too young to officiate as high priest, a relative, named Manasseh, represented him during his minority. The rule of Onias II became a turning point in the history of the Judeans. The constant warfare carried on for years between the rival houses of the Seleucid and the Ptolemies affected the fate of Jud. When at last a treaty of peace was concluded in 240, Assyria and Jud remained with Egypt, but the fourth king of the Seleucid, Antiochus Callinicos, instigated these provinces to revolt, and seems to have won over Onias II to side with him. Onias refused to pay the annual tax of 20 talents to the Ptolemies. Although the sum was small, the payment was looked upon as a mark of submission, and its refusal gave great offense at the Egyptian courts. Ptolemy II, after vainly demanding the tribute money, threatened to divide the province amongst various foreign colonists. He dispatched one of his own favorites, Athenion, as special envoy to Jerusalem. The Judeans in alarm and despair entreated Onias to submit, but he resisted their prayers. When matters had come to this crisis, there suddenly appeared upon the scene a man, Joseph by name, of extraordinary strength of will and purpose. He was the nephew of Onias, and son of Tobiah, who had married the daughter of Simon the Just. Fascinating in his manners, clever, cunning, and unscrupulous, the son of Tobiah seemed born to govern. Unfortunately for himself, 424 Onias, the high priest and ruler of the state, stood in his path. But now was the moment, as he thought, to remove the obstacle. As soon as Joseph was told of the arrival of the Ptolemaic envoy in Jerusalem, and of his threatening message, he hastened from his birthplace to that city, loaded his uncle Onias with reproaches for having led his people into danger, and finding the high priest determined in his resistance, he offered to go himself to Alexandria, there to commence negotiations with the king of Egypt. As soon as Onias had empowered him to do so, Joseph assembled the people in the courts of the temple, soothed their excited feelings, and made them understand that they were to place entire confidence in his ability to avert the danger that threatened them. The whole assembly offered him their thanks, and made him leader of the people, about 230. From that moment, Joseph displayed so much decision that it was evident a plan had long been ripening in his brain. He was well aware of the weakness of the Greeks, and knew that they were not indifferent to flattery and to the luxuries of the table. So he prepared tempting banquets for Athenion, fascinating him by his charm of manner, making him costly presents, and assuring him that he might return to Egypt, secure of the tribute money, which he promised should be paid to the king. As soon as the envoy had left Jerusalem, Joseph entered into negotiations with some Samaritan friends, or money lenders, to obtain a loan for his necessary expenses. In order to appear with dignity at the Egyptian court, he required splendid apparel, brilliant equipages, and money to defray the cost of his entertainments. Joseph had no means of his own, and in all Jud there was no one who could advance him large sums of money. The people, at that time, supporting themselves by agriculture, and not being engaged in commerce, had no opportunity of amassing wealth. 425 furnished with the means of making a great display at court, Joseph hurried to Alexandria, where the envoy Athenian had already prepared a favorable reception for him. Ptolemy Euergetes was anxiously expecting him, and was not disappointed when he arrived. He was enchanted with Joseph's daring and address, and invited him to be his guest at the royal table. The envoys from the Palestinian and Phaeacian cities, who formerly had derided his simple appearance, now remarked with envy upon his presence at court. He soon gave them occasion not only to envy but also to hate him. For by a crafty stroke, he managed to obtain a position of great trust, that of head tax gatherer of Assyria and Phaeacia. The king gave them a force of 2,000 soldiers, who were, if necessary, to lend their aid in the fulfillment of his duties, and Joseph became in reality the governor of all the districts that went by the name of Palestine. He was respected and feared as a favorite of the king, and he therefore did not hesitate to use extreme severity in levying taxes. In the cities of Gaza and Beth-Shean Sophopolis, the Greek inhabitants ventured to load him with insults, and to offer resistance. In return he beheaded the noblest and richest of the citizens, and confiscated their possessions for the Egyptian crown. For 22 years, Joseph held the post of satrap, and spent that time in amassing extraordinary wealth and attaining great power. After the death of Euergetes 223, his successor, Ptolemy VI, Philopator 222-206, retained him in office. He continued to act in the same heartless way, causing the following remark to be made in the presence of Philopator: Joseph is stripping the flesh from Syria, and is leaving only the bones. At one time, his lucky star seemed to wane. For the Seleucid king, Antiochus, called by his flatterers the Great 223-187, attempted to wrest the province of Assyria from Egypt 218. The 426 commencement of the attack augured success. The Egyptian commanders were treacherous, they went over to the enemy, and betrayed the garrisons into their hands. Jud and Jerusalem, under the control of Joseph, remained true to Egypt. But how long would they be able to resist an attack of the Seleucid army? And, if such an attack was made, which side should Joseph take? He must have lived through that time in the most painful anxiety. At last the decisive hour struck. In the spring of 217, Antiochus appeared on the sea coast near Gaza. He was at the head of a large army, composed of various nationalities. His route lay to the south, towards Egypt. Meanwhile, Philopator had roused himself from his life of ease and self-indulgence, and was advancing to Raphia to meet his enemy. Antiochus, overconfident of success, sustained a severe defeat, and was obliged to return to Antioch, and give up the possession of Caesarea. All the cities and communities that had been under his rule outbade one another in flattery and adulation of the conqueror, Philopator. Joseph remained in his position of trust, and continued to be the favorite of the Egyptian king. Through him, and through his connection with the court life of Philopator, a complete change had taken place in the Judean nation, hardly visible indeed in the provinces, but most striking in the capital. By means of the immense riches that Joseph had accumulated, a veritable shower of gold fell upon the country. He raised the people out of poverty and needy circumstances into ease and comfort. In order to collect the taxes of so many different towns, he was obliged to have responsible agents, and he preferred choosing them from amongst his own people. These agents enriched themselves in their own way, and bore themselves proudly. The consideration which Joseph enjoyed at the Egyptian court, his quickly gained wealth, and the troop of 427 soldiers always at his command, by whose help he held in check the people of various nationalities in Palestine, the remnants of the Philistines, the Peachitians, Idumeans, and even the Greco-Macedonian colonists. All this had the effect not only of lending him and his surroundings a certain air of self-importance, but also of raising the people in general from the abject, submissive position they had occupied towards the neighboring nations. The horizon of the Judeans, particularly of those who lived in Jerusalem, widened as they came into contact with the Greeks. Their taste became more refined, their dwellings more beautiful, and they began to introduce the art of painting. The Judeans of Alexandria, who had been for a century under Greek influence, and had, to a certain extent, become Hellenized, now brought their influence to bear upon their fellow countrymen, but the simplicity of the Judean habits and customs suffered in consequence. A shower of gold not only fails to have a fructifying effect, it often causes desolation and ruin. And so it was in this case. The rich upstarts lost their balance. They attached undue importance to the possession of riches, and preferred money-making to every other occupation, but the most unfortunate feature was that they became blind admirers of the Greeks, whose extravagant habits and frivolous customs they soon acquired, to the deterioration of their own national virtues. The Greeks loved conviviality, gave public banquets, and indulged in most unruly merrymaking at their repasts. The Judeans imported the custom of dining in company, reclining on couches whilst they ate and drank, and indulging in wine, music, and song at their entertainments. All this was innocent enough. But unfortunately it led to more than merely making life brighter. Greek frivolity and extravagance threw their imitators rapidly into a vortex of dissipation. Joseph was constantly at the court of Ptolemy 428 Philopator, when business took him to Alexandria. This court was a hotbed of depravity. The days were spent in revelry, and the nights in shameless debauchery. The prevailing depravity led astray both the people and the army. Philopator entertained the absurd belief that his ancestors were descended from the god of wine, Dionysus Bacchus. And he considered himself obliged to introduce Bacchanalian revelries into his kingdom. Anyone wishing to ingratiate himself with the king and his boon companions was forced to belong to the fraternity of Dionysus. Whenever Joseph was called to Alexandria, he enjoyed the doubtful honor of being invited to the king's orgies, and of being received by the followers of the god of wine. It was at such a feast that he contracted a violent passion for one of those dissolute dancing women who never failed to be present upon these occasions. Jerusalem did not long remain untainted by this social impurity. Joseph, from friendship, let us suppose, for his royal patron, introduced Dionysian festivals into Jud. At the turning point of the year, when winter makes way for spring, when the vine bursts into blossom, and the wine in the barrels ferments a second time, then the Greeks held their great festival in honor of Dionysus, the festival of the barrel openings. 2 days were devoted to intoxicating orgies, when friends interchanged pitchers of wine as presents. He who drank most was most honored. This festival of the barrel opening was now to be celebrated in much the same way in Jud. But, in order to clothe this festival in a Judean garb, the rich made it an occasion for dispensing alms to the poor. Revelry is always the attendant of excessive indulgence in wine. The rich Judeans soon copied the Greek customs, and, callous to the promptings of shame and honor, they introduced singers, dancers, and 429 dissolute women at these festivals. A poetical writer raises a warning voice against the growing unchastity of the age. Meet not with an harlot, lest thou fall into her snares. Use not much the company of the songstress, lest thou be taken with her attempts. Give not thy soul unto harlots, that thou lose not thine inheritance. Equals 6. 3. Sec. The love of art and beauty which Joseph introduced into Jud did not compensate for this loss of chastity and morality. Even earnest men, under Greek influence, began to cast doubts upon their old traditional belief. They questioned whether the teachings of Judaism were correct and true throughout, whether God really demanded from man the denial of all self-gratification, and whether the deity in any way concerns itself about the great universe and the small world of mankind. The teachings of Epicurus, inculcating the impotence of the gods, and recommending self-indulgence to man, were well received by the degenerate Gro-Macedonians, and particularly by the upper circles of the Alexandrians. It was from that city that the poison spread to Jud. In Jerusalem also doubters arose, who disregarded the teachings of Judaism. These doubts might have led to increased mental activity, had not discord been added to the corruption of manners. Feelings of jealousy sprang up between the 7 sons of Joseph by his first marriage, and the youngest, Hyrcanus, the son of his second wife. The latter was distinguished in youth by his quick intellect, his ability, and his craftiness, characteristics that endeared him to his father. In the year 210, a son was born to the king Philopator. The different representatives of the cities of Caesarea were anxious to express, by presents and congratulations, their devotion to the Egyptian king. Joseph felt that he ought not to absent himself upon such an occasion. But his growing infirmities not for 30 allowing him to undertake such a journey, he asked one of his sons to represent him. Hyrcanus was the only one who felt equal to the task, and his brothers unanimously requested their father to accept his services. At the same time they suggested to their friends in Alexandria to put him out of the way. But Joseph's young son instantly gained favor at court. His extravagant gifts upon the great day of public congratulation, 100 handsome slaves to the king, and 100 beautiful female slaves to the queen, in the hands of each a gift of a talent drew the presence of all others into the shade. His ready wit and adroit tongue soon made him a favored guest at Philopator's table. He returned to Jerusalem filled with pride. But his perfidious brothers were lying in wait for him on the road, and determined to accomplish what the Alexandrians had failed to do. Hyrcanus and his companions defended themselves, and in the combat which ensued killed 2 of his brothers. His father received him sternly on account of his extravagance in Egypt, being perhaps also jealous of his extraordinary popularity. Hyrcanus dared not remain in Jerusalem, and probably returned to Alexandria. Thus far, this discord was confined only to the family of Joseph, and seemed not to affect the people at large or the inhabitants of Jerusalem. No one could have imagined that the violent dissensions among the members of the house, and its Greek proclivities, would end by bringing misery upon the whole nation. The present seemed bright and sunny. Prosperity was widespread in the land, and offered the means for beautifying life. The neighboring peoples acknowledged the supremacy of the Judean governor, and none ventured to attack the nation, or to treat it with contempt. Jud had not known so peaceful a state of things since the age of Nehemiah. It was, therefore, not unnatural that a poem in the 431 form of a love song should have appeared at that time, shedding a rosy flush over the age, and reflecting happy and joyous days. A cloudless sky, green meadows, fragrant flowers, and, above all things, careless lightheartedness are mirrored in it, as though there were no more serious occupation in life than to wander over hills of myrrh, to repose among lilies, to whisper words of love, and to revel in the ecstasy of the moment. In this period of calm which preceded the storm, the Song of Songs Shir HaShirim was written. It was the offspring of untroubled, joyous days. In it the Hebrew language proved its capability of expressing tenderness and depth of sentiment, exquisite dialogue and picturesque poetry of nature. The author of this poem had seen the life of Greece, had felt the charm of its literature, and learned the cunning of its art. But beneath the veil of poetry he reprovingly pointed out the evils of the time. In contrast to the impure and unchaste love of the Greek world, our poet's ideal is a shepherdess, Shulamit, the beautiful daughter of Amminadab. She bears in her heart a deep, ardent, unquenchable love for a shepherd who pastures his flock among the lilies, and with and through this love, she remains pure and innocent. Her beauty is enhanced by her grace of movement, by her soft voice and gentle speech. As her eyes are like the dove's, so is her heart full of dove-like innocence. In the flowery language of the most exquisite poetry, the author of the Song of Songs denounces the debauchery of the times, the lewdness of the public dancers and singers, the voluptuousness of town life, and the enervating effects of riotous living. Joseph, the grandson of Simon the Just, died in the year 208, leaving his family torn by dissension. His office was to be transferred to one of his sons. But Hyrcanus, the youngest, being the only one known at the Egyptian court, and a 432 favorite of the king, the preference was no doubt given to him. This fired the hatred of his brothers. They assumed a hostile position towards him upon his arrival in Jerusalem, and as Hyrcanus had a large number of followers, civil war seemed imminent. The action of the high priest, Simon II, who sided with the elder brothers, turned the scale, and Hyrcanus was again compelled to flee the city. If he intended pleading his cause in Alexandria, as he probably did, he was disappointed, for he could obtain no hearing at the Egyptian court, as his patron Philopator had just died 206, and Egypt was a prey to disorder. Two ambitious kings, tempted by the weakness of the house of Ptolemy, seized upon Egypt and her provinces, and divided them. These were Antiochus the Great, of Syria, and Philip of Macedon. Joseph's elder sons, or, as they were generally called, the Tobiades, out of hatred to their younger brother, Hyrcanus, determined to side with Antiochus against Egypt. They raised a Sosidan party. They are described as scoffers and reprobates, and, as matters went on, they showed themselves to be unprincipled men, who sacrificed their country's weal to their thirst for revenge and the gratification of their lusts. They opened the gates of Jerusalem to the Syrian king, and did homage to him. The adherents of the Ptolemies and of Hyrcanus yielded or were crushed. Thus Jud came under the rule of the Sosidan kings 203-202. But an Aeolian commander of hired troops, Scopas, undertook to oppose the Syrian conqueror. He soon overran the Jordanic and Transjordanic territories, causing terror amongst the Tobiades and their followers. Desperately but in vain they struggled against their impending doom. Scopas took Jerusalem by storm, laid waste the city and the temple, and put to the sword those who were pointed out as hostile to him. Numbers sought safety in flight. 433 inches ordered to secure the allegiance of the conquered people. Scopas left a contingent in the fortress of Phares or Acra. But the reconquest of Jud and Caesarea for the son of Ptolemy, the child Epiphanes, was not to be lasting. The Syrians now reappeared on the scene. In the beautiful valley at the foot of Mount Hermon, near the mountain city of Panion, at the source of the Jordan, a terrible battle was fought, in which Scopas and his troops were entirely routed. Jud once again became a prey to the horrors of war and internal dissensions. She resembled a storm-tossed ship, flung violently from side to side. Both parties inflicted unsparing blows on her. Antiochus succeeded in reconquering the greater part of the land, and then marched upon Jerusalem. The people, headed by the Sanhedrin and the priests, came out to meet him, bringing provisions for his troops and elephants. But the Aeolian contingent still held the fortress of Acra. Antiochus, or one of his commanders, with the help of the Judaenes, undertook the siege of the fortress. The Sosidan king, it appears, greatly valued the friendship of the Judaenes, for he gave orders to rebuild their ruined city and repaired their temple. They were treated with much consideration, and were allowed to govern themselves according to their own laws. None but Judaenes had the right of entering the temple. No impurities were suffered to pollute it, and no unclean animals were to be bred in Jerusalem. Antiochus remained in undisputed possession of Caesarea, and therefore also of Jud. But he cast a greedy eye upon Egypt and her neighboring provinces, of whose conquest, since they were under the rule of a boy king, he felt assured. But the Romans, free for action since the downfall of Carthage, formed a stumbling block to his progress. Compelled to abandon his plans on Egypt, Antiochus conceived the idea of making war upon the Romans, 434, and after having conquered them, of seizing upon Asia Minor and Greece and also Egypt, but his foolhardiness and overconfidence led to his humiliation. He suffered so crushing a defeat at the hands of the Romans 190, that he was obliged to give up his conquests in Greece and in a part of Asia Minor, surrender the whole of his fleet, and pay 15,000 talents annually, for 12 years, to the victor. He was constrained to send to Rome as hostage his son, Antiochus Epiphanes, who was destined to leave a bloody mark upon the annals of Judean history. Severe was the penalty that Antiochus paid for having overestimated the strength of the Sosidanes. In order to be able to pay the heavy indemnity, the Syrian kings robbed temples. This sacrilege made them odious, and stirred up the hatred of the most patient nationalities. Antiochus, Jernin the Great, met his death through one of these acts of rapine 187. The sacrileges continued by his son became the cause of the rise to new strength of the Judean nation, as well as of the humiliation and decadence of the Sosidan kingdom. The disintegration of the Judean community, which began under Joseph's administration, increased rapidly during the constant struggle between the Sosidanes and the Ptolemies for the possession of Caesarea. The leaders of the two parties were not particular as to the means they employed to forward their own cause, or to injure that of their antagonists. The friends of the Sosidanes were above all things determined to find allies amongst the foreign nationalities in and around Jud. The Greeks living in Palestinian places, as well as the native Gentiles, hated the Judaenes, on account of the humiliations they had suffered at the hands of the tax collector Joseph. There were other antagonistic races besides. The old names of the enemies of the Judeans still existed, recalling the warlike 435 days of the judges and of David's reign. The Edomites and the Philistines were in possession of Judean territory, and the former occupied even the ancient city of Hebron. Both hated the Judeans, and made them feel this hatred upon every occasion, whilst in the north the Samaritans did the same. The Judean settlers in the provinces of the South Kingdom looked up to the Gro-Macedonian rulers, commanders and officers for protection from their numerous foes. But in order to curry favor with the Greeks, it was necessary to endeavor to become like them in manners, customs and observances. As to Jerusalem, those who held nice to themselves in outward appearance, determined upon educating the Judean youth according to the Greek model. Thus they established races and contests in wrestling. The richest and most distinguished among the Judeans belonged to this Greek faction, amongst others, Jesus Joshua, the son of the high priest, who called himself Jason, and who was followed by many Aaronides. The party was led by the Tobias, or sons and grandsons of Joseph the tax collector. But as Jewish law and custom were sternly opposed to such innovations, and held in especial abhorrence Greek shamelessness, these factions determined to abolish the faith of the fathers, that the people might be Hellenized without let or hindrance. Complete incorporation with the pagan Greeks was their aim. Of what use was the fence erected by Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Sanhedrin around Judaism? The Hellenists pulled down the fence, and showed a desire to fell the primeval trees of the forest too. As has repeatedly occurred in the history of thinking nations, lack of moderation on the one side brought forth exaggeration on the other. Those Judeans who saw with pain and rage the attempts of the Hellenists grouped themselves into a party which clung desperately to the law and the customs of 436 their fathers, and cherished them as the apple of their eye. They were the community of the pious, or Chassidim, a development of the Nazarites. Every religious custom was to them of inviolable sanctity. A more complete contrast than was presented by these two parties can hardly be imagined. They understood each other as little as if they had not been sons of the same tribe, people of the same nation. That which was the dearest wish of the Hellenists, the Chassidim condemned as a fearful sin. They called its authors breakers of the law, trespassers of the covenant. Again, what was dear and sacred to the Chassidim, the Hellenists looked upon as folly, and denounced as a hindrance to the welfare and stability of the community. Amongst the Chassidim there were two noted teachers of the law, Jos the son of Joer, of the town of Zereda, and Jos the son of Johanan of Jerusalem, each of them the founder of a school. The one laid more stress upon the theoretical study of the law, the other, upon the execution of its commands. Jos of Zereda taught his disciples, let your house be a place of assembly for the wise men. Allow yourself to be covered with the dust of their feet. Drink in their words greedily. Jos of Jerusalem, on the other hand, taught, let the door of your house be opened wide. Let the poor be your guests, and do not converse with women. Between the two widely opposed parties, the Hellenists and the Chassidim or Sidonians, the people took a middle course. They certainly took delight in the luxuries and refinements of life introduced by the Greeks, and did not care to have their pleasures narrowed by the severe Chassidim. At the same time they disapproved of the excesses of the Hellenists. They refused to break their connection with the past, or to have it obliterated through innovations. But the passionate warfare that existed between Hellenists and Chassidim, menacing with extinction one of 437 the two parties, obliged the moderates to take sides with one or the other of them. The pious, or patriots, were still supreme in their position of command in the community. At their head was Onias III, high priest, son of Simon II. He is described as a man of excellent character. Though gentle by nature, he was an enemy to wrongdoing, zealous for the law, a strong advocate of piety, and uncompromisingly opposed to Hellenistic practices. The Hellenists accordingly hated him fiercely. His principal enemies, besides the Tobias, were three brothers, of a distinguished Benjamite family, who vied with each other in insolence. Iman, Onias called Menelaus, and Lysimachus. They hated the high priest not only on account of his constant opposition to their innovations, but also on account of his alliance with Hyrcanus, who was still suffering from the persecutions of his brothers and their followers. Hyrcanus was in great favor at the Egyptian court, and Ptolemy V had given him the control over some Transjordanic territory. Armed troops were probably at his disposal to help him in the discharge of his duties. The Judeans who colonized the province were probably loyal to him, or were employed by him. By their aid he was able to levy contributions from the Arabs, or Nabat Ns, of the provinces of Hezbon and Madaba, as ruthlessly as his father Joseph had once done in Assyria. In this way he accumulated vast wealth. He erected a wonderful citadel of white marble, upon a rock near Hezbon, to all intents and purposes a fortress, but of surpassing beauty. He called this magnificent palace Tyrus. He surrounded it with a wide moat of great depth, and constructed the gates of the outer wall of such narrow dimensions that they admitted only one person at a time. Hyrcanus spent several years, probably from 181 to 175, in this mountain retreat. The surplus of the wealth accumulated by Hyrcanus was sent from time to time, for safekeeping, 438 to the temple in Jerusalem, which enjoyed the privilege of inviolability. Simon, the Benjamite, held some kind of an office in the temple, whereby he came into conflict with the high priest. Onias banished Simon from Jerusalem, and in order to stem the ever-growing anarchy in the city, he passed a similar sentence of exile upon the Tobias. But by doing this he only added fresh fuel to the flames. Simon devised a diabolical scheme for wreaking vengeance upon his enemy. He repaired to the military commander of Assyria and Phaeacia, Apollonius, son of Thrasaius, and betrayed to him the fact that great treasures, not belonging to the sanctuary, and consequently royal property, were hidden in the temple of Jerusalem. Apollonius lost no time in giving the king, Seleucus II 187-175, information on this subject. Seleucus thereupon sent his treasurer Heliodorus to Jerusalem with orders to confiscate the treasures concealed in the temple. Onias naturally resisted this unjust demand. Heliodorus then showed his royal warrant, and prepared to force his way into the sanctuary. Great was the consternation in Jerusalem at the thought of the heathens entering the temple and robbing it of its treasures. However, by some means or other, this sacrilege was not perpetrated. We are not told what means were employed for preventing it, but tradition, born of pious reverence for the temple of God, has given the coloring of the miraculous to the whole proceeding. But Simon could not desist from his attempts to bring about the downfall of the hated high priest. He even had recourse to the aid of hired assassins. Fortunately, he was unsuccessful. But Onias was now thoroughly alarmed. He determined to lay the real state of affairs before King Seleucus, with an account of the conflicting parties and of the motives that induced Simon and the Tobias to conspire against him. Imploring the king's protection and aid 439 he appointed his brother Joshua, or Jason, as his delegate, and repaired to Antioch. During his absence the Hellenists, eager to obtain the office of high priest for one of their own party, redoubled their intrigues. A high priest from among their own number would not only be master of the treasures in the temple, but leader of the nation. He could assist them in the introduction of Greek customs, and, by reason of his spiritual office, add weight to the efforts of the Hellenists, who had become so demoralized that they held nothing sacred. These secret devices soon became known, and roused the indignation of many who clung to the old customs and traditionary teachings. Amongst these was a poet and writer of proverbs, Jesus Sirach by name, the son of Eliezer 200-176. He was prompted by the wrongdoing he witnessed in Jerusalem to write a book of pithy sayings, applicable to the evils of the age, which might prove salutary to its student readers. He was a successor of the proverb writers. He was familiar with the law, the prophets, and other instructive and spiritual works, and he was a close reader of the older book of Proverbs, imitating the style of that work, though without reaching its graceful simplicity. Sirach did not belong to the sterner Chassidim who refrained from all harmless pleasures, and who denounced others for enjoying them. On the contrary, he was in favor of the social meal, enlivened by music and wine. To those who made a point of interfering with innocent pleasures, and whose dismal talk put an end to all gaiety, he addressed the following rebuke. Speak, thou elder in council, for it becometh thee, but with sound judgment, and show not forth wisdom out of time, as a signet of an emerald set in a work of gold, so is the melody of music with pleasant wine. Eclis. XXXII. 3, 4, 6. There were some overpious Judeans who condemned the use of all medical skill and aid. They 440 insisted that as all maladies were sent from God, he alone could cure them. Sirach explained in his proverbs that the skill of the physician and the virtue of medicines were also the gifts of God, created to serve the purpose of healing. But all his zeal was kindled at sight of the social and religious backsliding of his brethren, and their consequent humiliation in the eyes of the neighboring peoples. The social depravity of his co-religionists grieved him more than their political oppression. Sirach sung with a lash of sarcasm the arrogance, deceit and lust of the rich Hellenists, who worshipped Mammon. He also denounced lechery, warned them against the companionship of dancers, singers and painted women, and he painted in no flattering colors the portraits of the daughters of Israel.